how Toyota quality has changed, but we bought one anyway. You know, a lot of years have come and gone, and Toyota's garnered a reputation for one of the most reliable manufacturers on the entire planet. And me personally, I've owned a multitude of different Toyotas over the years, from 4Runners, Tacomas, to Corollas, and even this current generation Toyota Camry. I also used to work for Toyota. I received vehicles, did preparation for sales, I sold vehicles, as well as wrenched on a multitude of different Toyotas. So I feel like I'm in a place to actually comment on this transition and changes that we've seen in the quality of Toyota over the last 20, 30 and more years. Things have changed, and there's reasons for it. Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? Well, from my own personal experiences and opinions, I'm going to share that. I'm going to summarize what's been going on with Toyota, how the quality has changed, what's been going on in recent years, and does it in fact means that Toyota is going drastically down in quality? Yes, things have changed. Prices have gone up. The complexity of vehicles have gone up. And Toyotas were often vehicles that were coming from a place where you could neglect. You could actually defer and put off oil services, brake changes, coolant changes, and people would do that. And the vehicle would continue to run. And that was one of the key elements. There was enough tolerance within the manufacturing and the engineering and the design of these vehicles that you could pretty much neglect it. You could abuse it, neglect it, and it would still continue to run. And that's been my overall experience up until recently. And we want to talk about what some of those changes are in the last couple of years. And have we seen some big changes? Since the C word, since 2020, there have been decided differences. And I have a vehicle right now. I'm sitting in a 22 Camry with one of their more reliable 2.5 liter 4-cylinder engines. And it actually has sort of an older torque converter transmission, which is kind of hard to come by these days in a lot of manufacturers, particular manufacturers that are creating smaller front-wheel drive platforms. Most vehicles now are becoming, powered through a CVT transmission, a smaller turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. That seems to be the modern trend, and Toyota hasn't exempted themselves from that. They're also getting on the wagon, and that's clearly part of what I see as somewhat of their demise, or somewhat this shift in overall reliability. But let's take this from many years ago. I look at some of the older vehicles. We look at some of the older, 80s, 90s. Let's just say the 4Runners from 1991. Let's go back how many years? And the 4Runners with that 3-liter. See, they weren't perfect either. And that's what a lot of people who believe Toyota are the end-all be-all and the most reliable product. They are easily, continually to be one of the most reliable products on the market. But that's being challenged today with some technological advancements, change in drivetrains and sort of attitudes and complexities. That is changing. But think about back in that 1991 Toyota. And I drove a lot of those many, many years ago. The Toyota 4Runners were wonderful. The Tacomas were wonderful. They were on the same platform. And they had that new hot little 3-liter V6 engine. And it seemed great on paper. But we all forget about some of the big pitfalls that Toyota has gone through. Now, this isn't a knock, but what we're seeing is a continued trend. And what we've seen often with Toyota is this idea of creating a product, putting it to market, having a few tripping hazards and falling over and landing on their nose once or twice. But the difference is with Toyota, they often take ownership. And they don't just ride it through like some manufacturers we see today. They know they have problems, and they continue to put this stuff out to market and create more issues and more problems for customers on the customer's dime. And Toyota, that's the difference. Toyota is not perfect. And that 3-liter V6 wasn't perfect either. See, because back with that Toyota 4Runner and the Tacoma, specifically the 4Runner, I know many people have owned them as well, as including myself. I've driven those vehicles, and they were wonderful. They weren't powerful, but they felt very truck-like, and it was a wonderful platform. But that 3-liter V6 had engine issues, head gasket problems. It was a major problem. But Toyota realized that. It took them a couple years in, all the talk, all the banter. And see, back then in 91, you didn't have all the internet. So you didn't have people that were able to compare notes. You didn't have the accelerated communication of problems that you see today. Like the Tundra today with that new 3.4. Everybody knows about that. But see, back in the 90s, you didn't have that information transfer. It just was not available. The internet really was, not quite the same capacity. You didn't have the forums like you do today. You didn't have people that were that tech savvy. And clearly just vehicles like that, people would just deal with it with their service network. And a lot of those problems were firsthand experiences. And almost everybody I knew who had one of those early generation that, early 90s, Toyota, in this case, 4Runner or Tacoma, knew that there was problems, but they learned it themselves and they didn't learn it on the internet. So things didn't get all explosive and nuclear. See, Toyota has never really been that brand that's always been, creating products that are overly dynamic and exciting and wild and insane. They've more flourished on the idea of, taking pride and quality in their vehicles, making vehicles that are built to last a long time, even if you neglect or abuse them. Now, a lot of these engines aren't designed to abuse. And if you've ever tried to rev up a Toyota engine really hard and aggressively, you'll find there's just no inspiration to keep revving it. They're designed in such a way that the power delivery is not one in which it coaches you to keep accelerating, accelerating and pushing the throttle to the floor. It's one in which you get up to speed, you get a mid-torque, you get a strong torque band in the middle, and then it sort of peters out. So it's one in which that people generally learn and adapt to the driving behavior of a Toyota, which is one that's made it to drive in a very conservative manner. And that's why a lot of clienteles who own Toyotas find that they are ultra reliable. Some of it is the product, some of it is the way the deliverables. The vehicles aren't designed to be race cars. And they're quite honestly, for many years, they were quite boring. Look at early generation Highlanders. Look at older generation Camrys, older generation Corollas. Those were all very bland vehicles. But, interestingly enough, some of those early 90s generation Corollas, I still see them driving around. I still see some of those early generation Toyota Camrys driving around. You don't see too many older BMWs like that unless it's some niche car that people wrapped up and put and tucked away in their garage. But for people that are using their vehicle relatively regularly, those vehicles don't last. But Toyotas do. So Toyotas come from this attitude of pride in construction, learning from the mistakes, and actually taking the accountability and changing those mistakes, fixing those mistakes. You could probably search the internet and find all kinds of problems, like the Denso fuel pump. Okay, that was a distributor issue. Okay, there was issues as well with the floor mats. Well, how have they rectified that? Well, it was outfitted with the incorrect floor mat, which created that sudden acceleration, which garnered a lot of bad news, and rightfully so. But they fixed it. And so part of it was correcting that, put the right floor mat in, make sure it's fastened. And now in this 2022 model Camry, if you can believe it, it also has one of the checklists on their multiple point checklist. When you take the vehicle into the dealer for your annual service, they go through and check, oil, brake wear, fluids, windshield wipers, brake, all that, the lights, everything. They look at from top to bottom, check all the points. And the floor mat is a checkpoint. It's actually on their checklist from the factory. So when they find a problem, they do their best to make sure that they don't revisit that same problem. And so they have had issues. They've had some engines that have seen some bad oil burning problems. They've seen heavy coking on oil rings. They've seen some of the coking results in oil consumption. And then they've had some engines with heavy oil consumption. A lot of that was now in the way for Toyota to transition into a place of being more competitive, because remember, back in the day, they built a very simple, boxy little car that didn't have a lot of tech involved. It had a very basic engine that was tried and true, and they kept reusing that engine over and over and over again. But in doing that, they were saving costs on the other end, and their focus was primarily on reliability. So they didn't need all this extra tech and all this high performance engines and big wheels. You weren't paying for that. You were getting a basic, simple vehicle that underneath was ultra reliable. But now, as time goes on, expectations of buyers change. Buyers want some of that modern technology. You know, the older Camrys, the older Corollas, they were very simple inside. A few buttons and knobs. You could probably count the amount of buttons on the display, on the center console on one hand. It was a very simple setup, but there was less to go wrong. And see, that's the conundrum. And that's where Toyota has always taken the attitude of less is more. And so keeping things simple, continuing old tried and true drivetrains like the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder and just constantly revising that, making it slightly better, enhancing it with variable valve timing, enhancing the different valves, the head configuration, the adaptability to hybrid technology. Ultimately, it's still the same core engine. This 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine has been around a long time. Also, the 3.5-liter V6, another core engine. You don't hear a lot of problems there either, do you? And so when you go and look on the internet and you think, all of a sudden Toyota is crashing and burning in terms of reliability, it's always the same issues seem to be coming around and around. And it's easy to take a shot at Toyota. Why? Because they have so few. And when you do a recall check on NHTSA, or, you know, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, you're going to find some recalls. You'll find the floor mats, the Denso fuel pumps. You'll find some challenges in there. They're going to take ownership on some of their technology issues. And while they're not perfect, again, they try to get to the bottom of these issues. Now, part of the problem here is, as time goes on, customers are getting fussier. They want more. They expect more from their vehicles. And then along come these other manufacturers. We look at vehicles, for example, competitors, Hondas, always coming up with great high-revving engines, make it interesting. Infiniti, that was the upscale brand of Nissan, also came to the table with some great new style, better performance. And now all of a sudden, even with BMWs and some of their price point vehicles on the lower end of the spectrum, like their 1, 2 series, even some of their 3 series vehicles, as well as some of their smaller X series vehicles, they were priced in a place that was very competitive with Toyota's, but they seem to have more performance, more technology. Granted, some of that all came at an expense of reliability, but when you're buying a car new, you don't know that. And you're a shopper and you're looking for some of these vehicles, you're now looking feature to feature, number to number, power to power, you know, fuel economy, horsepower. All of those factors come to play. So when you look at this old platform Toyota here, with an old engine that's been around for 10 years, and the performance numbers, the fuel economy is not wonderful, the acceleration's kind of meager, and the specifications in terms of technology inside is very basic. And then you compare over here with this 2 Series BMW that has better performance, better economy, way more technologically advanced, and some cute features. That's what started to bring some of these other vehicle manufacturers into the equation. And that's where things started to shift for Toyota. This need to start to become more competitive. And competition is wonderful. But sometimes competition forces people to compromise quality. And a lot of it comes in the way of cutting corners. Now, Toyota, one of the first places that they realized to become more competitive was, okay, we have to up our ante with some of the features, some of the electronics and the technology. We have to start adding some of those in here. And that started happening when we start looking in the early 2000s, even say more so when we hit kind of the 2008, 2012, in that space, we started to see more of that competitive nature, where Toyota realized that they had to start competing with some of their strong competition coming down the market. So in doing so, they had to start cutting corners because they still wanted to be that reputable manufacturer that was selling an affordable vehicle that was reliable. But where could they cut corners? They had to integrate more tech, more electric features like sunroofs and, heated elements, seats, and so on. But they had to do it at the similar price point that they've always been doing it. So if you've noticed, and I've noticed over the years, and I can literally attest from I look at some of the vehicles I've had way back in the 90s, and I look at the older 4Runners and even the older Corollas, well, they were a simple car and they had a lot of plastic. Parts didn't squeak, parts were solid, parts were well made, robust. They never felt like they were going to break. Parts didn't come apart. It was just a simple, strong vehicle that was just made to outlast any one of us. But then as you get into these later years, you'll find some of this technology now, sure, they're getting lane assist and heated this and power sunroofs and all-wheel drive systems. And we've got infotainment. We've got heated elements everywhere. And I'm looking right here. And I'll be the first to admit, this is how they cut corners in cost savings. And it's putting lower quality feel. Now, it's not necessarily lower quality products because a lot of the supply chain, they hold them to account. And of course, if you have a weak supply chain with poor suppliers, then you're going to wreak havoc, i.e. Denso, in my personal opinion. But what happens, even with wireless charging and you got your USB plugins and your center infotainment screen here, and I see a lot of great technology in this vehicle. The fact remains is the corners don't feel as well polished. I feel the edges of the doors, they're sharp. I look at the interior. While they're styled nicely and they're crafted, they have some nice texturing, there's sort of a cheaper feel. There is more of a squared off feel, sharp edges, harder plastics. And while the tech is here and they're doing their best to try to keep prices down, it's quite evident that there's places that the plastics just feel really cheap. And you could feel it on the interior of the vehicle. Now this next transition, they know they can't be competitive in the performance realm, although some would argue with that and say, well, what about the 2JZ Supra back in the early 90s? And I happen to drive those. They were some great cars. And people say Toyota was boring. I would say largely they were boring in their mainstream cars. But they had some fun cars. Remember the old Toyota Paseo? It was basically a Toyota Tercel. One of the most reliable cars, but the problem was the Paseo just never caught on, didn't sell very well, so they didn't last very long. They also had the Celica, or Celica, however you want to say that. Another sporty car that tons of young drivers could get their hands on. It was affordable, it was reliable, it was fun. And there's even some YouTubers today that still continue to brag about some of those early generation Celicas and how reliable they are. Well, how about that 2JZ Supra? I drove one of those. They were on another level. When that car came out in the early 90s, I actually drove one at the Toyota dealer. I got to take that for a drive. And boy, was I surprised and impressed. And even compared to some of their competition in the day. Because in the day, they had the Nissan 300ZX twin turbo. And Mazda had the RX-7 twin turbo. The Mazda felt nice and light on its feet like a cat. And the Nissan felt heavier and it felt a little bit more like a dog. There's no doubt the Supra stood out as the most premium of those three vehicles. It felt more substantial. It felt better put together. The quality materials felt better. And now we know 30 years later, how many years later, that's one of the few that are highly sought after. And there's reasons for it because it's highly reliable. It's a quality car with an engine that could tolerate heavy levels of abuse, modification, and that turbo inline six was built like no other engine. So it's not that Toyota can't build exciting vehicles. They can. Then they came out with, other sub-brands that they were creating fun spike. They tried to rejuvenate the brand and try to pitch more to the younger buyers to get younger buyers, because once the Supra moved on and once the Celicas sort of moved on, although they had some of the newer generation Celicas, the sales were dropping and the Supras went away, it just didn't feel like the market was there to support anymore. You had too much competition. Toyota was more interested in building volume quality vehicles that they knew that was their bread and butter. And so their continued focus on reliability was their number one. But honestly, over the years, that has been primarily my experience. You know, owning Corollas and Camrys and the trucks. The reliability has been nothing short of amazing. And I think that's what gets everybody in such a tizzy these days. For two common reasons. Well, number one is first of all the prices. So it's a little bit insult to injury. That's a big part of this conversation, because I do believe that as prices rise, the expectation of quality rises with this. But people are paying more than they've ever paid for Toyota. But Toyota's charging an exorbitant amount of money now for a lot of their vehicles. I've been shopping for Toyotas again. I was looking at buying a new Toyota. I was looking at buying an SUV. I explored the Highlander, but you can't get that V6 anymore. So I feel, even too, as a buyer and a long-term trusted Toyota loyalist, that it's a risk. Now, we haven't heard a lot of negative press on the 2.4 Turbo 4 that they've derived now, and that's replacing their naturally aspirated 3.5 V6. It's been fairly quiet. But it's still a little bit early to know, really. I mean, so to me, to go with the Highlander now that only either comes with that 2.4 turbo or with the 2.5 that has this engine, this vehicle tied to the hybrid, there's a lot of technology either way you go. And so the idea of buying an older garden variety, ultra reliable Toyota has gone away. That simplicity that we loved in Toyotas has vaporized. And now it doesn't mean that they don't create reliable products. It means that, remember, we talked about this, they have to maintain a level of competitiveness with the market. So now they're creating generating these engines that are producing more power, better fuel economy, smaller displacement, less carbon emissions, and in many cases with hybridization, they are resisting EVs, but hybridization or smaller displacement and turbocharging means they can accomplish those goals, and they're more competitive with their competitors, but they've been realizing some challenges in reliability. And now also to be competitive, this is where Toyota is starting to fall. Adding all these extra lane assist and adaptive cruise and all this technology. I mean, if you think of a vehicle and you think that there are 100 features in a standard garden variety, whether it's, signal switch or an auto, a cruise control feature or a power window, let's call it 100 features in an old school Toyota. Modern day Toyotas could be 300 features now with all of this new technology, new modules, new features, new buttons, new tech. It means that's 300% or 3 times the likeliness of failure. That's right, there's way more features and way more potential for failure. Now, many would argue that what's underneath the skin is all the same. That's not entirely true either. Because remember, the older Toyotas, they ran the older, if you look at the Lexus Toyota products, the 4.6, 4.7 V8s, the 5.7 V8s, they weren't great either. They were absolutely, to be honest, in the first few years, they were absolutely brutal, and they had a bad reputation, timing chains, oil consumption, coolant leaks, and they had rusting, and they had flexing fenders or flexing frames. They just weren't a very reliable vehicle, and they garnered a lot of negative reputation. But in retrospectively, they looked at the T100 before it as the better truck because it was the old truck that nobody bought, but nobody bought it for a reason. They didn't want it. It just lacked the polish and the features that every other vehicle in the market competition had. So they created this new vehicle, the 5.7 Tundra, and they thought they had a winner until they didn't. And customers hated on that truck. And then they created the next generation. You know what? Then they finally worked out the bugs. The 5.7 has evolved into a platform that is tried and true, one of the most reliable drivetrains in the business today. The later generation 5.7s are an absolute workhorse. Now, I personally know somebody that had a late generation 5.7, and he had some other issues, some sort of valve issue in the intake that some kind of problem, I don't even remember exactly how he described it, but it was a problem that he constantly lived with, and he had to babysit it and check engine lights. But the core fundamental engine was very, very reliable. Now we move to the next time. We move to the next generation, the latest and greatest Tundra, which is 3.4. It's been all over the internet. I'm going to add quickly. You know, I know, we're talking about this 3.4. It has this V6 fully derived to replace the outgoing 5.7s and some of their other V8 engines. They put this in a few different vehicles. They've had it in older vehicles, but specifically the ones that seems to be getting the reputation on are the new Tundra with the 3.4 twin turbo V6, as well as the Lexus LX600. GX550 has a similar, as well as some other models. But the bottom line is those two trucks seem to be suffering the fate of a lot of catastrophic engine failures. Now you're hearing a lot of news of it, and rightfully so, with, you know, allegedly particulate floating around in the oil that wasn't cleaned out properly during machining and took out the main bearings. And there was cases where there was multiple repeats by the same owner. So it really built a really nasty reputation for the first couple of years. But times have moved on, and it appears that Toyota's learned their lesson. And not only have they learned their lesson and they've rectified going forward, because you don't really hear these problems in the latest run of 3.4s. This was all in the first year and a half, first series run of that 3.4. Toyota, in all of their, you know, long-standing pride for craftsmanship and quality control, they've stretched and said, look, we're going to replace all these engines at our dime. They would rather eat the cost and save the reputation or part of it than just walk away from it, fix the problem, and ignore what's behind you. Like a lot of manufacturers are doing that. And we're seeing what ends up happening for brands. I mean, I could go on. We know some of the issues that we're seeing and how some of the big three domestic products are treating their customers with creating a substandard product with a lot of issues. A lot of cases, unless they're held by NHTSA, they're not even continuing to fix these issues. So it's clearly a scenario that Toyota is taking very seriously. They want to on the promise of reliability to their customers. But something else is going on. Reliability has been taking, in my opinion, a little bit of a slide. But it's not necessarily the product itself. It is a Toyota issue, in my opinion, because Toyota, BMW, Mercedes, Honda, Ford, Jeep, it doesn't matter. They all set a set of standards. So they come up with a set of maintenance practices. And a lot of those maintenance practices are a result of, you know, say, look, we've got better advancement in oil. We've got better advancement in spark plug technology, coils. We've got auto shut off, means the vehicle idle time is lower. It means you can extend the length of a lot of these components. You can extend the life of oil. You can extend the life of a lot of those components, and maintenance can be extended and deferred. And so what they end up doing is a lot of these manufacturers, and Toyota included, has elected to create these longer service intervals. And we've done the same thing. We've got the service intervals for our Camry here, and we're kind of doing it once a year, and we're putting on, you know, 10 to 12,000, 15,000 kilometers a year. And we're barely doing one. We're kind of almost into the second one. So it feels like we're barely doing enough oil services to cover 10,000, 12, 15,000 kilometers. It feels to me, you know, coming from more of the old school, that we're overextending these maintenance practices. And that's part of the issue. Now, why would Toyota do that? Doesn't Toyota know better? Well, you got to remember, a lot of these car manufacturers now are also selling maintenance packages, right? As you pay for the vehicle, then they shimmy you over to the next shop or the next office that's trying to upsell you on maintenance or on protection packages, extended warranties, maintenance packages, all of these things that they want to add on, paint protection film, undercoating, all these elements key fob protection and replacement programs, scratch and dent, glass etching, all these elements they're trying to sell you when you get to the next office. But what's happening now is for those people that are buying into the maintenance plans, and whether Toyota's doing it or whether they're directly having success on it or not, their competitions are selling more of those packages. Meaning that if one of their competition says, you know what, our manufacturer says you only need to do oil changes every 12,000 miles, and Toyota says you need to do an oil service every 5,000 miles, people now are of more of the throwaway opinion. People now want more hands-off. People are looking for ways to save money. And if they're looking at the two competitions, there's so many people that are just looking at the numbers and saying, I'll take those guys and our maintenance package. I don't even need to do an oil change. I won't even need to touch doing any oil services for 5 years. Because remember, as they're selling you a maintenance package, the more that they do oil changes, so the more frequent oil changes that they're going to plug into the owner's manual, the more they're held to the service package too. So that means they're going to have to do it on their dime. And so now in this whole manic maneuver to try to maintain this sense of competition with all of their, because let's face it, this whole market is one big competition. So what they end up having to do is they have to match it what everybody else is doing, or they have to come close to it. Because if everybody's doing the same thing, at least you've got a level of competition that you can maintain. Okay, so now they extend their service intervals to match up some of their competition, because they don't want to look like the needy brand with high maintenance requirements. People want to, they have the expectation, and some of this better oil nowadays. The old Dino oil isn't so good, so now the synthetic oil is much better. You don't need to change the spark plugs. I know lots of people that have never changed a spark plug in the life of their vehicle. So it's nothing to say, if there's a misfire, you replace it. But at the end of the day, it's pretty easy to start extending the maintenance practices when you know that a lot of people are shopping around. And that's the problem. So they're trying to maintain this level of competition, but in the meantime, they're foregoing some of that reliability, because now it's twofold, you see. Because now Toyota is creating, and Lexus, engines that they've never done before in the mainstream. Sure, Toyota Supra had a twin turbo straight six, but that wasn't a high mile vehicle that was used every day. That wasn't typically a daily driver. The daily drivers were typically always a basic little 4-cylinder or 6-cylinder engine, some of the V8s. They were always the basic, tried and true. And so they had to maintain reliability with the core. And you don't hear a lot of the older vehicles breaking down. You still see a lot of those old vehicles around today. But you're hearing a lot more of the new stuff breaking down today. Why is that? Why now are we seeing so much failures? Even the Tacoma, you've heard about that new automatic transmission with the torque converter problem there? Sadly, there's another issue, because they're doing too much too soon. And a lot of it is all for the sake of competition. The transmission, it's newly derived. They'll fix that up as well. But unfortunately, it's a new design. Again, they're doing too much at once. It's a new design that's causing some problems. They're saying with the manual transmission, you're fine. The automatic in the Tacoma, look out. It's got some issues. But as in Toyota fashion, they're replacing those transmissions. If you see a certain series of engine faults, check engine lights that indicate that you've got that torque converter lockup or that pressure system that's failing, they will potentially swap out that transmission free of charge. So they're taking ownership. But the problem is they're taking on too much. There's too much change, too much advancement at once. Now they're bringing on turbocharging with their 4-cylinder and their 6-cylinder engines. Turbocharging creates more heat, and not just more heat. There's a bigger demand on oiling. We know their variable valve VVTi systems require high pressure oil in that system. We know that oil is also fundamental to the base engine operation, keeping the bottom end of the cranks, the cam lobes, and all of the internal components, keep them lubricated. The piston rings keep everything greasy so it does not wear. But now they've added another element, and that's turbochargers. But the thing is, remember, a lot of people that are buying Toyotas conventionally are of the sense that I can drive it till the wheels fall off. I can neglect my maintenance. I can defer my maintenance. It can tolerate it. I have loose tolerances. And these big V6s are easy, simple, and they just last forever. So that same mindset now is transferring over to this new 2.4 and a 3.4 turbo 4s and 6s, where now turbocharging has a much greater demand on oiling. The excessive heat, when you're seeing the tens of thousands of degrees temp on the exhaust side of that turbine, means that you're imposing a lot of that heat into the oil, the bearings, and that oil makes its way through the rest of the engine. Of course, there's going to be a bigger demand on maintenance. And Toyotas are like any vehicle. They'll break like anything else, but they need that service. They need that oil change. But I've already said, as we've all seen, the extended oil service intervals. So they've hit it. They've burned that candle on both ends, if you will. And now they've created fundamentally a problem for themselves. They've created engines that are fundamentally less reliable. If you went back to some of your older maintenance practices with more frequent oil changes and oil services, and you took care of more of your regular maintenance practices, you'll probably find more of those issues becoming less problematic and less common. Now, I know, and I hope, for the sake of, I hope I'm not offending anybody by saying that, you just got to do more oil changes. I mean, what was the story with the 3.4s and the Tundras? That was a legitimate issue, and we know that. And Tundra did take ownership on that. So we've seen that. They've had failures in the past. They've taken ownership for it, and they're moving on. So unfortunately, we're seeing all over the internet, and including myself, because I see it all the time. And, I speak as an advocate because I'm a previous owner of many cars and many Toyotas. I've worked for Toyota. I've worked on Toyotas, but I've worked for them, selling them, prepping them. And quite honestly, Toyota is just, they're still making a quality product. Now, I'm going to be honest, why did I buy this car if the new Toyotas are not reliable? Well, first of all, I want to start out by saying I truly believe Toyotas of pretty much all makes are relatively reliable. And I use the term relatively because the way I see this, even a bad Toyota, an unreliable Toyota, is better than a reliable Audi or Mercedes, if you get the drift. So some of the most problematic Toyota products still generally have less troubles than some of the better mainstream luxury car brands that we know, VAG, Volkswagen, Audi, some of those brands that are struggling. Stellantis, some of the worst vehicles. Of course, we're seeing Jeeps and Dodges and Chrysler products with way more issues. It's not even in the same discussion. So they're still all relatively reliable. But I bought this vehicle, or we bought this Toyota Camry knowing that the transition was coming. We weren't totally on board yet with hybrids at the time when we bought this. This was 2 years, almost 3 years ago now. And we realized that, of course, if you're going to buy a hybrid system, Toyota's making the very best. There's no doubt about it. They've got the best in the business. And so Toyota knows how to build hybrid, and they also know how to build a CVT, the continuously variable transmission, which also coincidentally is one of the most toxic, unreliable transmissions in the industry. Just ask Jatco, ask Nissan how that worked out for them. So Toyota builds something a little different. Instead of the belts, the pulleys, they're doing more of a planetary gear system. It's more online. It's far more robust. And so if you're going to lean on certain technologies like CVTs and hybrid, Toyota's the brand. They've perfected that tech where everybody else is struggling, just trying to be different. So while those are tried and true by Toyota, we still felt like we wanted to keep it simple. We wanted to keep things old school, conventional, tried and true, and we weren't that ready to go full beans, spend a lot of money, and try on some new technology that we're not that comfortable with. So we wanted to buy something that was of the older variety on the way out the door. Hence, we bought this 2022 Toyota Camry. This one here happens to be the SE with the all-wheel drive upgrade because we live in the northern climates. It's nice to have when you have snowy roads. But other than that, we kept it fairly basic. Sure, we've got sunroof and we got heated seats here, heated steering wheel, which those are nice features for the winter. But we weren't looking for really complicated vehicles. We wanted a simple drivetrain, which is their 2.5, naturally aspirated. It does make 203 horsepower, so it's not that slow. And we also got the automatic transmission, the torque converter automatic, which just means that you've got one of the most reliable, older generation combinations for Toyota. But with all of that said, and it doesn't matter whether you're driving an old school Toyota or one of these new school Toyotas, part of the issue that I've been realizing in my experience of ownership and working on some of these vehicles, as well as some friends and mechanics that own shops that continually say every car breaks, you've got to do your servicing, and more frequent oil changes is always better. So if I can offer a word of advice, if you're looking at a new Toyota and you're thinking, are they reliable? Are they not reliable? They've got some problems. I'm always of the believer, and we've saw this back in the 3-liter V6. We've seen some of their changes into a whole new different type of drivetrain where they struggle a little bit, where they kind of transition into that next series or next generation. That's where Toyota, like a lot of people, fail. You never buy the first year of any car, and it doesn't matter if it's a Toyota or a Dodge. So my word of advice would be, always step in with a Toyota product, probably by the 3rd year of that type of drivetrain. That's the time to get in. Usually there's still follow-up from recalls and initial break-ins and failures and learnings. So by the time you're into the 3rd year, you've got enough information on hand. The other thing I would offer up, and with this vehicle here, we've even said, look, we've got to do more oil services than what the recommended factory number looks like. We're going to start likely cutting our service intervals in half. Because I truly believe, even with some of these reliable drivetrains, you're going to still see premature oil consumption. And now, with some of these engines, like this 2.5, apparently with the oil control rings and some of the low tension piston rings, means that there's less opportunity to scrape, clean, keep everything clean, and more likeliness of building sludge in the engine with longer duration oil services. So the bottom takeaway is, never buy the first year. Wait to watch what that technology is doing before you buy it. Increase your maintenance service intervals, because we know Toyota's mechanical, like everything, it needs maintenance. And if you don't do that, you will have troubles. And other than that, I truly do believe that other than the few cost-cutting measures that Toyota's taken, a lot of the parts they've changed, door panels, edges of doors, fit and finish on the interior, sharp edges, components like that, they have cut corners, in my personal opinion. But they've got to cut it somewhere. The only downside right now I see with Toyota is the prices are getting out of hand. Now we know the cost supply chain, parts going up, and since 2020-21, the escalated price of living, cost of parts, cost to buy vehicles of any brand has gone up. But ask yourself, if Toyota was such an unreliable brand, why are they one of the lowest day supply vehicles on the market? Why do you have to wait 3 to 6 months for any given Toyota? If you go in there, walk into the dealer today, you have to wait for that vehicle. Now, some of it is the business model, the sell on demand, and they don't want to stock a lot on the floor, and they realized that during the big C period, during 2020 to 22, they realized that having all that extra inventory meant floor plan costs and meant extra costs to the dealers. So they were of the impression that they could just keep a very minimal skeleton amount of vehicles on the floor and still sell it. But the point is, they don't have trouble selling their vehicles. Sales are up, sales are doing well. And just like Honda, sales are doing well. Mitsubishi sales are doing well. The Japanese brands are doing fairly well. And so Toyota, it's still popular. It's still a relatively reliable vehicle with some caveats. Do your studies. Don't buy the first year model and increase your maintenance costs. That's why we bought this brand new 2022 Toyota Camry.